Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. We'll begin now with Story 1, The Eternal Servant, Khaimweset and the Forgotten Tombs of Ancient Egypt. The Forgotten Heir. You are standing in the shadow of the pyramids, not as a pharaoh or a god, but as a son who will never sit on the throne. The sands shift beneath your feet, and you walk not toward power, but toward memory. Khaimweset, the fourth son of Ramses II, lived during the 13th century BCE, a time often considered the high watermark of ancient Egyptian civilization. Unlike his brothers who pursued military fame or administrative dominance, Khaimweset turned his gaze backward. His mission was not conquest or command, but conservation. While his father erected colossal temples and immortalized his victories in stone, Khaimweset quietly made his name by restoring the tombs and temples of long-forgotten kings and nobles. His title, Sempriest of Ptah, and later, High Priest of Memphis, was both sacred and bureaucratic, grounding him in religious authority and civic responsibility. It is from this role that he became known as the first Egyptologist. But such a modern label simplifies the deep religio-political currents guiding his life. Sacred duty and dust. In Khaimweset's Egypt, memory was not a luxury. It was a spiritual obligation. Forgotten ancestors risked ceasing to exist in the afterlife. Names chiseled off walls erased not only legacy, but the very soul of the deceased. By restoring these crumbling tombs and temples, Khaimweset was not simply preserving history, he was reviving it. But this wasn't just about reverence. Each act of restoration also reaffirmed the divine legitimacy of his own family. By honoring the past kings, Khaimweset subtly implied that the house of Ramses stood in direct, sacred continuity with them. Every tomb he restored under royal sponsorship brought the present pharaoh closer to Egypt's mythic golden age. Still, the work was slow and meticulous. The desert had no mercy for crumbling masonry. Inscriptions were sometimes barely legible. Walls had to be re-etched, names clarified, lineages cross-referenced. Bureaucratic scrolls were compiled. Workers were dispatched to dig, measure, clean. This was boring work, satisfyingly dull and endlessly repetitive. But in the eyes of Khaimweset, it was holy. The living and the dead. Among the most famous restorations was the Pyramid of Unas, a 5th dynasty king whose structure had begun to disintegrate. Khaimweset ensured repairs were made, the name preserved, and most importantly, that ritual offerings resumed. In Egyptian belief, these offerings were not symbolic, they were real sustenance for the dead in the afterlife. By reviving the rituals, Khaimweset re-established the flow of divine energy between the worlds of the living and the dead. One might imagine him walking in silence through the necropolis, reading faded hieroglyphs aloud in ceremonial cadence, breathing life back into words nearly swallowed by the sand. For him, history was not just a record of the past, it was a fragile, flickering light that could be snuffed out if neglected. And yet he was no mere priest. As a prince, Khaimweset wielded political power and coordinated complex labor forces. He authorized expenses, selected sites, approved architectural plans. It was his vision that merged sacred memory with statecraft. Echoes in the Temple of Ptah. The Temple of Ptah at Memphis, over which Khaimweset presided, was a place where gods met bureaucracy. As high priest, he ensured that divine rituals were performed to the letter. the correct incense, the precise intonation, the ritual cleansing of sacred objects. There was no improvisation, only iteration. But the temple also functioned as an archive, a legal center, and a training ground. Here, the quiet pulse of Egyptian administration beat steadily. Tax records, decrees, name registries, all under the auspices of a god whose name meant the Creator. It is said that Khaimweset helped expand the temple's library of ritual texts and magical incantations. His interest in older scripts and rare wisdom may have led him to copy or collect writings no longer in general use. It is through such obsessions that he would become a figure of folklore centuries, later a learned man, so wise he became a magician in popular tales. But in his time, this magical association was nothing more than scholarly diligence. Khaimweset believed in precision and replication, not enchantment. A prince without a crown. Despite his achievements, Khaimweset never became pharaoh. As the fourth son, his odds were always slim. Yet he lived into old age and is believed to have died just before his father, who reigned for 66 years. His tomb, if it exists, remains undiscovered. No grand temple bears his name. His most visible legacy lies in other people's monuments, bearing small restoration inscriptions like, "Restored by the king's son, Khaimweset." He lived in the margins of stone footnotes to ancient glories. And yet, without his intervention, many of those glories would be lost to time. Centuries after his death, Egyptians remembered him not just as a priest or prince, but as Setni Khamwas, a character in a cycle of magical stories. In those tales, he deciphers secret books, challenges ghosts, and masters forbidden knowledge. These stories blur history and myth, but they reveal a truth. Khaimweset left behind more than stone. He left behind a story worth retelling. Unresolved thought. Why would a man so close to the throne choose to serve the dead rather than claim power among the living? Restoration as ritual power. The restoration work of Khaimweset was not a side project, it was an extension of sacred governance. In ancient Egypt, power and divinity were entangled in every brick laid, every name inscribed. To maintain the temples and tombs of the dead was to preserve the divine order, or Mat, the concept that bound the universe in harmony. Khaimweset, as high priest of Ptah and a prince, existed in a space that allowed him to act both as spiritual custodian and state official. Every chiseled name he restored was not just a respectful nod to the past, but a ritual act that helped keep the cosmos in balance. To us, cleaning up a crumbling monument might seem mundane, but to the Egyptian priesthood, it was akin to re-establishing the breath of the gods. A name spoken aloud restored a soul to eternity. A temple reactivated by ritual reconnected Egypt to its sacred origins. Khaimweset's projects, then, were both conservative and radical. Conservative in that they preserved the old, radical in that they suggested the present had the right and the duty to correct the failures of the past. The material and the spiritual. There is something almost modern in the way Khaimweset cataloged the ruins of earlier dynasties. Inscriptions attributed to him often include phrases like, "I found it decayed and rebuilt it as new." This wasn't just about aesthetics. Egypt's economy was deeply tied to its religious institutions. A neglected tomb or ruined temple was not only a spiritual liability, but a financial one. Priests employed workers, received endowments, owned land, and contributed to regional trade. Restoring a site meant reactivating these networks. Moreover, by focusing his efforts on earlier dynasties like the 5th and 6th Khaimweset effectively reminded Egypt of its deep history. At a time when Ramses II was building colossal monuments to himself, Khaimweset was threading his dynasty into the long continuum of rulers who had held divine favor. There is a subtle political brilliance in this. By binding the past to the present, Khaimweset elevated his family's legitimacy not through conquest or edicts, but through preservation. The message was clear. Ramses II ruled not just by might, but by inheritance of sacred tradition. The case of Saqqara. One of Khaemweset's most ambitious restoration efforts was at Saqqara, the sprawling necropolis just south of Cairo. This ancient cemetery had served as the burial ground for kings of the Old Kingdom, now largely forgotten or buried under shifting sands. Khaemweset undertook the monumental task of re-identifying these tombs. In an era without modern archaeology, this meant deciphering eroded inscriptions, matching texts with royal names from temple archives, and rebuilding crumbling structures to recognizable forms. He focused especially on the step pyramid of Djoser, one of Egypt's oldest and most iconic monuments. Djoser had been buried nearly 1,000 years before Khaemweset's time, yet the prince spared no effort in restoring his legacy. He had new inscriptions carved into the surrounding chapels and temples, bearing both Djoser's name and his own, linking the two across centuries. This act of restoration was not just piety, it was an assertion of continuity. In honoring Djoser, Khaemweset placed himself and his dynasty directly in line with the originators of royal sacred power. These weren't just repairs, they were acts of historical claim. The bureaucracy of eternity. Behind the image of Khaemweset walking through tombs in white linen robes lies a massive bureaucracy. Restoration meant logistics, hearing laborers, managing scribes, gathering materials, and negotiating religious jurisdictions. This work required endless documentation scrolls, plans, inspections. Stone had to be quarried and transported. Priests had to be recruited or trained to perform newly revived rituals. Resources from the royal treasury were likely requisitioned, and disputes would arise over ownership and ancestral rights. Khaemweset was no solitary scholar. He was a project manager of the sacred, working with an army of artisans, priests, and scribes to restore not only buildings but forgotten social systems. Every inscription he commissioned, every name he revived, was part of a broader administrative goal: to integrate the memory of the past into the machinery of the present. Egypt, after all, was a civilization obsessed with eternity, and eternity needed records. Literacy, magic, and myth. Because of his extensive knowledge of older texts and rituals, Khaemweset's legacy took on an otherworldly shine. Later generations, especially in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, came to see him not merely as a prince or priest, but as a sorcerer, a man of hidden knowledge. In the popular tales of the Setni Kamwas, cycles written during the Ptolemaic period, Khaemweset becomes a character, a seeker of forbidden books, a traveler between life and death, a man who outwits spirits and defies fate. One tale tells of him discovering the Book of Thoth, buried deep within a magical tomb. Another has him competing with a powerful magician from Nubia. These fantastical stories are fiction, but they reflect a cultural truth. Khaemweset had become a symbol of arcane wisdom. His scholarly work in reviving ancient rites, deciphering old inscriptions, and collecting sacred texts likely gave rise to this mythical aura. While there's no evidence that Khaemweset practiced magic, as we think of it today, his deep literacy and spiritual authority certainly appeared supernatural to later generations. This blending of history and legend reveals how intellectual power was viewed as magical in a society where language itself was considered divine. Khaemweset's place in Egyptian memory. Unlike many other royal sons, Khaemweset left behind no tale of conquest, rebellion, or succession struggle. His narrative is one of quiet authority, sustained by ritual, texts, and architectural revival. And yet, his legacy endures more clearly than many kings. While some of his brothers faded from memory, Khaemweset's name was etched into monuments not as a conqueror, but as a caretaker. He re-established offerings, reopened closed shrines, and reinforced the sacred economy. His restorations were not radical reimaginings, but respectful renewals. and in doing so, he shaped how Egypt remembered its own past. Still, his story ends in partial mystery. His tomb has never been definitively identified, though some scholars speculate it may lie hidden near Saqqara or Memphis. For a man so obsessed with legacy, the absence of a known burial site seems ironic, or perhaps fitting. After all, his true monument was never meant to be a tomb of his own, but the tombs of others he saved. Unresolved point. If Khaemweset believed so deeply in memory and preservation, why did he leave so little behind about himself? The servant and the sovereign. By the final years of Khaemweset's life, Ramses II had outlived most of his children. The aged pharaoh reigned for over 6 decades, one of the longest in world history, and outlasted nearly all his heirs. Khaemweset, the quiet scholar prince, was among them. It's believed he died in his 60s, just before his father, never ascending to the throne himself. And yet, he had become one of the most visible royal figures of his time, though not through war, diplomacy, or dynastic drama, but through the preservation of the dead. It's a striking paradox, a prince who lived for memory, yet chose to serve that memory in others rather than elevate his own. There were no campaigns of conquest, no treaties bearing his seal. Khaemweset's signature act was this, walking through the dust of time and rewriting what had been forgotten. In a dynasty obsessed with grandeur, his was a life spent honoring those who no longer held breath or voice. The revival of names. If you were to walk through the necropolises of Saqqara or Abydos, you might come across inscriptions bearing Khaemweset's name carved beside those of kings long dead Unas, Teti, Djoser, restored with subtle but clear attribution. Restored by the king's son, the Sempriest Khaemweset. There was no fanfare, no boastful language, just a quiet notation that someone had remembered. These inscriptions acted as footnotes in the great book of Egyptian kingship, inserted 1,000 years later by a man who refused to let history decay under sand and silence. And this practice, as subtle as it was, redefined royal duty. Khaemweset demonstrated that sacred kingship was not just about conquest or construction, it was about continuity, the eternal weaving of the past into the present. The first Egyptologist. Modern scholars often call Khaemweset the first Egyptologist. While the term is anachronistic, it's not entirely unfair. He was the first known figure in history to study, document, and restore ancient monuments with an explicit concern for historical accuracy. He read worn hieroglyphs, re-established lineages, and even published in the form of stone inscriptions his findings. Some scholars suggest he may have compiled lists of kings, a precursor to the king lists that would later appear in New Kingdom temples. If true, this would place him at the beginning of Egypt's own historical consciousness, a shift from mythic memory to curated chronology. Yet there is no evidence that Khaemweset viewed this work as history for its own sake. For him, the past was not an academic curiosity, it was a spiritual inheritance, and forgetting it was a sin against divine order. The rise of the cult figure. Centuries passed, dynasties rose and fell. Foreign powers, Libyans, Nubians, Persians, Greeks ruled Egypt in succession, and yet Khaemweset's name persisted. By the time of the Ptolemaic dynasty, long after Egyptian independence had faded, he reappeared, this time not in inscriptions, but in tales told aloud. In the Setni Khama stories, Khaemweset is no longer just a priest and prince. He becomes a seeker of forbidden books, a man who opens ancient tombs and awakens spirits. In one tale, he steals a magical scroll from a mummy, unleashing curses and visions. In another, he is taught a moral lesson by a pair of spectral brothers. These stories were wildly popular, written in Demotic script and blending Egyptian themes with Hellenistic storytelling. They mark the beginning of Khaemweset as myth, a cultural hero who embodied the mystery of Egypt's own forgotten grandeur. Ironically, these magical tailies probably horrified the real Kime Wasit, who was devoted to order and discipline, not necromancy. But the transformation is telling. A man who once revived the dead became immortal in legend, his own name preserved in oral memory. Lessons from a tombless man. Kime Wasit's physical tomb, if it exists, remains hidden. Unlike the grandiose sepulchres of his father or other royal siblings, his resting place has not yet been identified with certainty. Some believe it lies under the modern suburbs of Cairo. Others suspect it may never be found. But in a way, that absence is poetic. His greatest legacy was not a monument to himself, but the restoration of others' memory. His work lives not in stone statues or sunken treasure, but in the resumed rituals, corrected inscriptions, and revived names that he left scattered across the Nile Valley. His story offers a quiet but profound lesson, that the true weight of power may lie in what we choose to remember and whom we refuse to forget. And in a world that often honors the loudest voices and the tallest monuments, Kime Wasit's legacy reminds us of the dignity of the quiet custodian, the one who walks among ruins and restores what time tries to erase. Final reflection. Why do we remember conquerors more than caretakers? And if memory itself is power, then what does it say that the most enduring legacy of this royal son was not rule, but reverence? Story 2. Gods at the Gate. The Apis bull and divine continuity in Memphis. Where the bull walks, the god breathes. You find yourself in the sweltering heart of ancient Memphis, sometime during the New Kingdom, perhaps around 1200 BCE. The Nile murmurs in the distance, fields sway with grain, and the limestone walls of the great temples of Ptah shimmer in the sun. But today, the attention of priests, scribes, and commoners alike is fixed not on the gods of the heavens, but on a single living creature. A bull, black of coat, marked with sacred signs, housed in regal splendor. This is not just any bull. This is the Apis, the earthly vessel of the god Ptah, creator of the world, god of craftsmen and order. The Apis is not symbolic. It is not a metaphor. The Apis is Ptah. In a society where the divine was immanent, woven into the flow of rivers, the cycle of crops, the rise of dynasties, the Apis bull was a living god. It breathed the sacred. It walked as an oracle. It ate in ritual silence and died in cosmic significance. But what does it mean to call a bull a god? And how did this tradition survive dynasties, disasters, and foreign conquests? The origins of sacred cattle. The worship of sacred bulls in Egypt predates even the pyramids. Long before Memphis rose as a political capital, local cults revered powerful bovines for their strength, fertility, and connection to the sun and earth. By the time of the Old Kingdom, these reverences had coalesced into official cults. Among them, the Apis became preeminent, housed in Memphis and carefully chosen by high priests who scoured the land for the right calf, one born with a specific constellation of markings. A white diamond on the forehead, a mark shaped like a vulture or wing on the back, a scarab-shaped birthmark beneath the tongue. These signs weren't decorative, they were read like scripture. The bull was not selected. It was discovered, as if Ptah had breathed himself into flesh once more. Once identified, the calf was removed from its mother and taken to the House of Life, a temple palace where it was groomed, fed, worshipped, and presented to the people. Divinity in daily practice. You might imagine worshipping a god animal would involve mystery and seclusion. In fact, the Apis was highly visible. Processions led the bull through the streets of Memphis, where it served as oracle and judge. Crowds gathered to see which direction it would walk, which offering it would eat first, or even how it bellowed, each action a divine signal. Foreign ambassadors were said to wait weeks just to catch a glimpse of the Apis, hoping to interpret its behavior as a sign of favor or warning from Egypt's gods. In the temple complex, the Apis lived a life of luxury. Gold-trimmed stables, purified water and food, attendants and priests trained in ritual protocol. It was not a passive idol. It participated in rituals, symbolized royal legitimacy, and stood at the center of major festivals, including the Heb Est, a royal rejuvenation ceremony for aging pharaohs. This was not merely pageantry. The Apis was a sacrament in motion, and its very presence affirmed that the divine remained among the people. The intersection of power and flesh. The Apis bull served a critical political function. In an age where the pharaoh ruled not just as king, but as divine intermediary, the presence of a living god in animal form provided concrete evidence that the cosmic order was intact. During transitions of power, especially after a pharaoh's death, the Apis bull was often used in rituals to confirm legitimacy. It might be led to inspect the new ruler, or its reaction studied for divine approval. In this way, the bull served as both oracle and instrument, a living barometer of the god's will. But the Apis could also serve to check royal ambition. There are recorded instances where the bull refused to eat in the presence of certain rulers, or turned away during key ceremonies, actions interpreted as signs of divine displeasure. Even the pharaoh could be corrected by the will of this silent, four-legged deity. Death of a god. No story of the Apis is complete without addressing what happened when the bull died. Unlike most animals, which were buried in simple pits or used for food and offerings, the Apis bull was given a royal burial, often with greater ceremony than human nobility. Its death was not the end of its divinity, but a transformation. In death, the Apis merged with Osiris, the god of the afterlife, becoming the composite deity Osorapes, or later Serapis, under Greek influence. Massive stone sarcophagi were carved from granite, weighing up to 60 tons, and lowered into catacombs at Saqqara, known today as the Serapeum. This vast underground network became a sacred site for generations. Each burial began a new search for a calf born with the proper signs, continuing the cycle, a god reborn in flesh. Continuity amid collapse. Despite the collapse of dynasties, invasions by Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, and later Persians, the cult of the Apis endured. It was a religious institution that transcended political turmoil. Why? Because the Apis offered something Egypt valued above all else: continuity. It was a tangible, dependable reaffirmation that, no matter what happened in the political sphere, the gods still walked among men. Even foreign rulers understood this. The Persian king Cambyses II, after conquering Egypt in 525 BCE, reportedly killed the Apis bull in a fit of rage. The act was so sacrilegious that it sparked widespread revolt. His successor, Darius I, quickly reversed course, funding a new Apis burial, restoring temples, and reaffirming the bull's divine status. In a land where kings came and went, the Apis never stopped being a god. Unresolved thought. How did a mute animal wield such influence across dynasties, cultures, and religions without ever speaking a word? Beneath the sand, the Serapeum of Saqqara. If you were to walk the limestone plateau of Saqqara in the 6th century BCE, you might come upon a deep and solemn descent. Hidden below the dry surface lies a series of shadowed passageways, carved into bedrock and guarded by silence. The Serapeum, burial place of the Apis bulls. This is not a haphazard graveyard. These underground chambers form one of the most sophisticated and awe-inspiring complexes of the ancient world. Stretching over 350 meters, the Serapeum houses massive granite sarcophagi, each over 3 meters tall and weighing more than 60 tons. Every tomb was designed for a single bull, and each was inscribed with prayers, invocations, and the name of the reigning pharaoh who oversaw the burial. The first confirmed use of the Serapeum dates to the reign of Amenhotep III, though earlier burials likely occurred elsewhere. Over time, as the cult grew in complexity and prominence, the tombs became increasingly monumental. This subterranean world was not a forgotten corner of religious life, it was a spiritual engine, churning slowly beneath Egypt's theological core. The burial rituals. The death of an Apis bull triggered a series of ritual events designed to ensure its safe passage into the divine realm. The process mirrored royal funerals in almost every detail: embalming, mummification, mourners, and ritual lamentation. For over 70 days, the traditional length of Egyptian mourning, the priests of Memphis prepared the body with sacred oils and linen wrappings. The bull was buried with amulets, scarabs, and food offerings, sometimes alongside carved statuettes of gods or the reigning pharaoh. Its name, lineage, and date of death were recorded with precision. Each burial was a cosmic event, marking the end of a divine incarnation and the expectation of its return. During this interregnum, priests would begin the next sacred search, a new Apis calf born with the correct markings. Until the new god was found and enthroned, ritual life in Memphis paused. Echoes of a timeless cycle. In this continuous cycle: discovery, worship, death, burial, rediscovery, the Egyptians enacted a theology of eternal recurrence. The Apis bull was always the same god, yet always reborn. It was a creature of paradox, perishable but eternal, animal but divine, local but universal. The burial process reinforced this paradox. The physical bull died, but its essence fused with Osiris, the eternal god of death and resurrection. The resulting composite Osirapis linked animal worship with broader theological concerns about the soul, the body, and the afterlife. This is how an animal cult, often dismissed as superstition by early historians, functioned as a deep philosophical statement about the nature of being and time. It was not primitive idolatry, but a sustained, ritual meditation on mortality, divinity, and the possibility of rebirth. The Greek encounter. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, he found a land already ancient, already layered in religious tradition. His successors, the Ptolemies, were quick to understand that rule in Egypt meant rule over religion, and at the center of this religious universe stood the Apis bull. Rather than abolish the cult, the Greeks embraced it, but with a twist. Under Ptolemy I, the Greeks merged Egyptian and Hellenistic ideas by introducing Serapis, a new composite deity drawn from Osiris, Apis, and the Greek gods Zeus, Hades, and Dionysus. This Serapis was given a human form, a bearded, robed god enthroned, and holding a staff more palatable to Greek artistic sensibilities. Yet at his core, Serapis still carried the legacy of the Apis bull, and the Serapeum remained a site of pilgrimage and state-sponsored ritual. This theological fusion allowed the Greeks to rule over both Egyptians and fellow Hellenes by providing a shared divine figure. The Apis had, in a sense, evolved no longer just a sacred animal, but a cross-cultural symbol of divine continuity. Divinity under pressure. While the cult of the Apis flourished under the Ptolemies, it came under increasing scrutiny during the Roman period. Romans admired Egypt's ancient grandeur but viewed animal worship with suspicion or ridicule. Some writers, like Juvenal and Pliny the Elder, mocked the idea that a cow or bull could be divine. Yet despite elite disdain, Roman emperors such as Hadrian and Antoninus Pius still funded the cult, donated gifts to the Serapeum, and sponsored Apis burials because the cult retained its popular influence and remained key to political legitimacy. Indeed, coins minted under Roman emperors bore the image of Serapis, and Apis processions continued into the 2nd century CE. But under the surface, tension brewed. As Christianity gained prominence and began to dominate religious life in Egypt by the 4th century CE, animal worship was increasingly targeted. Church fathers condemned it as idolatry, and Christian mobs led by figures like Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria destroyed many temples, including the Great Serapeum of Alexandria around 391 CE. Still, the memory of the Apis could not be erased so easily. Its tombs at Saqqara remained untouched for centuries, buried beneath the sand, silent but intact. Archaeological awakening. The rediscovery of the Serapeum in the 19th century by the French Egyptologist Auguste Mariette marked a turning point in our understanding of the cult. Mariette, driven by reports of strange underground passages and local folklore, excavated the site in 1850. What he uncovered astonished the world. Dozens of massive sarcophagi, Greek and Demotic inscriptions, votive offerings left by worshippers across generations. Some of the sarcophagi still bore names of bulls and dates, stretching back nearly 2,000 years. This was no minor religious curiosity. This was a pillar of ancient Egyptian theology, stretching from the Old Kingdom to the Roman era, outlasting empires, evolving with languages, and remaining central to the Egyptian soul. Today, the Serapeum stands not only as a testament to animal worship, but to the profound human effort to anchor divinity in flesh, to find eternity in the mortal world. Unresolved question. Why did the Egyptians cling so tightly to a divine bull, even as their world changed around them? Was it faith, or something deeper, a need to touch the sacred in the shape of the everyday? Final days of flesh and stone. The Apis bull, even in death, demanded grandeur. The granite sarcophagi that housed each sacred body were carved with care and reverence, made to survive eternity, sealed in the dark beneath the desert floor. Yet even as the stone endured, the living faith around it began to tremble. By the late 4th century CE, the ancient world of gods in animal form faced pressures it had never known before. Not from foreign conquerors this time, but from a new faith rising rapidly: Christianity. This new religion brought with it a very different idea of divinity, one that rejected the embodiment of God in animal form, condemning it as idolatry. And unlike previous conquerors who had adapted or adopted Egypt's religious customs, Christian authorities sought transformation, not accommodation. The destruction of the Serapeum. The breaking point came around 391 CE in the city of Alexandria, one of the largest and most volatile urban centers of the Roman Empire. Tensions between pagans and Christians had been escalating for years. Public processions, philosophical schools, and temple rituals, all associated with older religions, were seen as threats to Christian orthodoxy. At the center of this ideological clash stood the Serapeum of Alexandria, a temple dedicated to Serapis, the Hellenized fusion of Apis and Osiris. Once a marvel of architecture, filled with statues, scrolls, and scholars, the Serapeum was assaulted by a Christian mob reportedly led by the city's bishop, Theophilus. They smashed idols, burned sacred books, and dismantled altars. The symbolic act of destruction was clear: the age of sacred bulls had ended. There is no direct record of the Apis bull being present during this time. It was likely already buried at Saqqara, but the theological message was unmistakable. The god, once born in stables and buried in granite, now faced oblivion. The vanishing of the living god. The cult of the Apis didn't disappear overnight. Some rural priests likely continued local rituals in secret. Travelers in later centuries mention odd animal worship or lingering processions in outlying temples. But by the 5th century CE, no new Apis bulls were enthroned. The search for the white-marked calf stopped. Egypt had changed. Its temples fell silent. The House of Life in Memphis was abandoned. Saqqara's sacred path, once trodden by priests, workers, and mourners, became a footnote. And with that, a tradition that had lasted nearly 3,000 years longer than Christianity has existed today came to a close. Not with a war, but with a shift in how humans saw their gods. The bull remembered. Ironically, the death of the cult ensured its memory. In the 19th century, explorers, looters, and scholars returned to Saqqara and the Serapeum. Among them, Auguste Mariette, whose excavations revealed not only tombs but inscriptions, votive objects, and the names of the bulls and priests who had served them. Inside these dark, echoing corridors, the memory of the Apis bull was reignited. A god once believed to speak through movement and breath now speaks again through stone and silence. Even in modern times, the Apis continues to fascinate. Historians see it as evidence of ancient political theology. Anthropologists see a symbol of sacred kingship and fertility. Theologians examine its influence on Greco-Roman religious fusion. And the devout, those who seek continuity with the past, walk the corridors of Saqqara in quiet awe. The enduring questions: why did the Egyptians invest so much ritual energy into a bull? Perhaps because the Apis offered something no statue or myth could: presence. It breathed, ate, walked, aged, and died. It was sacred and yet tangible, a divine body the people could witness and touch. For millennia, it offered certainty that the gods had not abandoned Egypt. In a world of sand and shifting rule, the Apis was constancy in the form of life. And even now, long after the rituals have ceased, there's a haunting recognition in the massive sarcophagi at Saqqara. You feel it as you stand before them, the awe of what humans once dared to call eternal. Final reflection: if gods once walked among us as beasts, what does it say about us that we no longer look for them in the ordinary world? Story 3: Pharaoh's Legacy, the divine claim of Persian kings in Egypt. An empire crosses the desert. The year is 525 BCE. The great Persian Empire, newly forged under Cyrus the Great and now led by his son Cambyses II, extends from the mountains of Central Asia to the edges of the Mediterranean. And it is about to take one more ancient jewel: Egypt. To the Persians, Egypt is a land of contradiction, rich in culture and stone monuments, but fractured by dynastic weakness. The ruling 26th dynasty under Psamtik III is young, inexperienced, and vulnerable. When Cambyses launches his invasion, Egypt's defenses crumble swiftly. But conquering Egypt by force is only the first step. The real challenge lies in conquering its gods. Because in Egypt, the legitimacy of power does not rest on birthright alone. It rests on the sacred rituals performed in temples, the ancient lineages traced to the gods, and the favor of a complex and ancient pantheon. To rule Egypt is to become a pharaoh, or at least convince the Egyptians that you are one. The sacred office of pharaoh. To most modern minds, pharaoh means king, but in Egyptian terms it meant much more. The pharaoh was the living Horus, a manifestation of divine authority, a cosmic figure who sustained the principle of universal order. Each pharaoh underwent rituals of divine birth, presented himself as chosen by the gods, and participated in temple life. Even their cartouches, their royal name rings, were often filled with divine references. This wasn't symbolic posturing. It was the engine of governance. Taxes were collected in the name of the gods. Temples controlled land, labor, and grain. Priests interpreted omens and advised the throne. A foreign ruler, even one with armies behind him, had to step carefully. Without divine recognition, he was just a conqueror. With it, he was eternal. Cambyses II then faced a choice. Would he crush the religious institutions of Egypt, or would he don the linen robes of a priest king? Cambyses and the Apis bull incident. One of the most famous and controversial episodes in this cultural collision is the so-called Apis bull incident. According to Greek sources, most notably Herodotus, Cambyses, upon entering Memphis, saw the Egyptians celebrating the birth of a new Apis bull. Enraged, believing it to be mockery of his recent victory, he allegedly stabbed the bull, mocked the priests, and ordered the festival stopped. To the Greeks, this incident was used to illustrate Cambyses' madness, impiety, and unfitness to rule. But modern historians are divided. In fact, Egyptian inscriptions tell a different story. A stela now known as the sarcophagus stela of Cambyses was found in the Serapeum at Saqqara. It records that Cambyses actually funded the burial of an Apis bull just like any legitimate pharaoh would. This discrepancy suggests either the Greek sources misunderstood the rituals and customs, or the story was propaganda crafted to discredit Persian rule. Either way, it highlights the fragile space Cambyses occupied, both king and outsider, divine and foreign, sacred and profane. Becoming pharaoh. Despite early missteps, Cambyses attempted to present himself as a legitimate Egyptian ruler. He adopted the full royal titulary of a pharaoh, including names like Mesutair, born of Ra, and was depicted in traditional Egyptian garb on temple walls. He also restored temple endowments, funded rituals, and upheld the cosmic balance in state documents. In other words, he did the things a pharaoh was supposed to do. But trust is difficult to win when your soldiers occupy cities, and your face is not the one carved on every shrine. Cambyses left no major Egyptian monuments of his own. He did not build pyramids, erect great temples, or leave behind obelisks bearing his name. His rule in Egypt was brief, only about 3 years, and his sudden death during a return march to Persia ended any long-term consolidation of his authority in Egyptian religious memory. In the minds of many Egyptians, Cambyses was still a stranger among the gods. Darius I, the divine strategist. The task of truly integrating Persian kingship into Egyptian sacred authority fell to Cambyses' successor, Darius I, the great reformer and administrator of the Achaemenid Empire. Darius took a much more systematic and careful approach. He embraced Egyptian temple life, patronized priests, commissioned hieroglyphic inscriptions praising the gods, and had himself portrayed on temple walls making offerings to Egyptian deities. Under Darius, Egypt saw restoration of canals and irrigation systems, tax reforms that protected temple wealth, construction of new temples, including one to Khnum at Elephantine. Darius even claimed descent from Egyptian gods in inscriptions, an audacious but calculated move to embed himself into the divine fabric of Egypt's history. He was not just a Persian king, he was trying to become an Egyptian pharaoh in full. Unresolved question: can a ruler born beyond the Nile ever truly be embraced by gods who rose from its waters? Ruling by ritual. When Darius I seized the Persian throne in 522 BCE, his rule was not immediately secure. He faced rebellions across the empire, including in Egypt. But rather than rule through fear alone, Darius crafted an approach that merged imperial pragmatism with religious legitimacy, particularly in Egypt, where divine sanction was everything. Understanding the Egyptians' deep reverence for sacred continuity, Darius pursued a deliberate campaign to entrench himself in Egyptian religious life. Unlike Cambyses, who may have ruled with indifference or even hostility, Darius made a point to rule with the gods, not above them. In Egyptian temples, his image was carved in traditional pharaonic style, smiting enemies before Horus, offering incense to Amun, and standing before Ma'at herself. These scenes were not decorative. They were ritual statements of legitimacy, asserting that Darius upheld cosmic balance. He knew that religious continuity bred political stability, and he leaned into that truth. The god Khnum and the temple at Elephantine. One of the most significant signs of Darius's integration into Egyptian religious life was his temple to Khnum, located at Elephantine, near the southern frontier. Khnum, the ram-headed god of the Nile's source, was the divine potter who shaped human bodies on his wheel and regulated the annual flooding of the river. By building and restoring temples to Khnum, Darius associated himself directly with the force that sustained Egypt's life. In dedicatory inscriptions, Darius refers to himself with typical pharaonic epithets, son of Ra, beloved of Amun, and declares that he has acted on behalf of the gods. The Elephantine inscriptions are written in hieroglyphs, not cuneiform, and invoke the blessings of Mad, proving his desire to be seen as a legitimate Egyptian ruler in both form and language. This was no small feat. It required cooperation from the native priesthood, mastery of Egyptian ceremonial forms, and willingness to work within an alien religious framework. But Darius was not simply posturing. His interest in Egypt went beyond politics, legal reform, and religious law. Darius commissioned Egyptian priests and scribes to codify Egyptian laws, a rare move for a foreign ruler. This Demotic legal code, while fragmentary today, represented an effort to align Persian imperial administration with Egyptian tradition. According to inscriptions, Darius proclaimed, "I know the wisdom of the Egyptians more than any king before me." Whether this was flattery or a political statement, the implication was clear. Darius positioned himself not only as a just ruler, but as a custodian of sacred knowledge. His reign also saw the protection of temple revenues, tax exemptions for clergy, and the restoration of temple lands, moves that earned him support among the priestly elite. In return, temples honored Darius as a pharaoh, not a foreign conqueror. His cartouches were inscribed alongside traditional rulers, and statues of him were placed in temple precincts. A complex coexistence. Still, Darius's acceptance in Egyptian society was not universal. While the priestly classes may have welcomed his patronage, ordinary Egyptians likely saw him as a distant figure, and revolts in Egypt continued during and after his reign. Moreover, the Persians never fully merged their religious worldview with Egypt's. At court, Persian Zoroastrian ideals of Ahura Mazda still dominated, and the Achaemenid kings continued to identify with their homeland and its sacred traditions. Darius ruled Egypt as a pharaoh, but he remained, at heart, an emperor stretching across a multicultural empire that demanded versatility more than devotion. Even so, his Egyptian reign is a rare historical case of a conqueror not only preserving, but enhancing the religious structure of a civilization he had subdued. The role of the Egyptian priesthood. The Egyptian priesthood played a vital role in this cross-cultural arrangement. They were the gatekeepers of divine legitimacy. Without their cooperation, Darius could not perform the necessary rituals, maintain the temples, or uphold the religious festivals that defined a true pharaoh. By collaborating with Persian rulers who respected their traditions, the priests were able to preserve their institutional power. In many ways, they used the Persians as much as the Persians used them. Their inscriptions about Darius are reverent. They record his temple donations, his maintenance of sacred practices, and his support for festivals like the Apet and Est ceremonies, which reinforced the ruler's connection to divine renewal. Whether or not Darius believed in the Egyptian gods as the Egyptians did is ultimately unknown. What mattered was that he behaved as if he did, and in Egypt, that was often enough. The problem of Xerxes. Darius's son and successor, Xerxes I, inherited both his empire and the delicate balancing act in Egypt. But Xerxes lacked his father's finesse. Early in his reign, Xerxes suppressed an Egyptian revolt and removed Egyptian royal titles from his official inscriptions. He ceased supporting some religious institutions and shifted attention away from the complex ceremonial duties that his father had so carefully maintained. This withdrawal had consequences. Xerxes's reign marked the beginning of a decline in Egyptian support for Persian rulers. Though Achaemenid control would continue intermittently for another century, the sense of divine harmony between king and gods was fractured. In the Egyptian imagination, Darius had walked among the gods. Xerxes stood apart from them. Unresolved question. If a ruler can adopt the rituals of divinity, does it matter whether he believes them? Or is sacred authority merely a performance, a mask worn to keep the world in balance? The Second Persian Period. A century after Darius I, Persian rule in Egypt collapsed only to return again under Artaxerxes III in 343 BCE. This Second Persian period was brief and turbulent, but it revealed just how fragile the divine status of kings had become. By now, Egypt had grown weary of foreign kings claiming to be sons of Ra. The temples remained, the rituals continued, but faith in the pharaoh as divine protector had eroded. When Artaxerxes reconquered Egypt, his arrival was marked by plunder and retribution, not rituals and offerings. According to Greek sources, Artaxerxes razed city walls, looted temples, and exiled priests. While modern scholars question the full accuracy of these accounts, it's clear that by the 4th century BCE, the sacred compact had fractured. The pharaoh was no longer seen as a bridge to the gods but merely a ruler in foreign robes. It's telling that this second wave of Persian rule left few religious inscriptions. No temples were built. No grand dedications to Amen, Ptah, or Khnum were recorded in hieroglyphs. Artaxerxes ruled Egypt, but he did not reign as pharaoh. The divine mask had slipped. Alexander the Great and the reimagined pharaoh. Then came Alexander the Great. When he entered Egypt in 332 BCE, he found a land once again yearning for a sacred king. Unlike the Persians, Alexander understood the power of ritual. He journeyed to the Oracle of Amen at Siwa Oasis, where he was reportedly proclaimed the son of Zeus Amen. This moment, part myth, part diplomacy, cemented his image as a divinely sanctioned ruler, acceptable to both Greek and Egyptian traditions. Alexander didn't just conquer Egypt, he inherited its sacred kingship. He wore the crown, honored the gods, and ensured that his name would be inscribed in temples beside the pharaohs of old. His successors, the Ptolemies, would take this even further, building colossal temples in native style, restoring priestly authority, and presenting themselves as living gods in both Greek and Egyptian fashion. The Persians had ruled with authority, but Alexander and his heirs ruled with theology. The memory of the Persian pharaohs. For centuries after their rule ended, the Persian kings were remembered ambivalently in Egypt. On the one hand, inscriptions in temple ruins and administrative records preserved their names, especially Darius I, whose piety was genuinely respected. On the other hand, Cambyses and Xerxes were remembered as foreign, hostile, and even mad, largely due to Greek writings that found an eager Egyptian audience. Strangely, while Cambyses had in fact funded the burial of an Apis bull and restored temple services, he was painted as a god-killer. Meanwhile, Darius, a Zoroastrian, was remembered as pious and wise. This suggests something deeper. Legitimacy in Egypt was not determined by belief or ethnicity, but by ritual performance, by honoring the traditions that kept the universe in balance. And for a time, Darius did this better than many native rulers. Legacy in stone and silence. The ruins of temples in Suez, Thebes, and Elephantine still bear Darius's hieroglyphic cartouches. His image stands chiseled into limestone, dressed as a traditional pharaoh, holding offerings to the gods. These are not Persian carvings. They are Egyptian ones, commissioned by Egyptian priests, who wrote his name in sacred signs and aligned him with Horus and Mad. In this way, Darius achieved something few conquerors ever have: a place in the religious memory of the people he subdued, not just as a ruler, but as a guardian of their sacred order. The gods of Egypt, it seems, were willing to bless a foreigner if he bowed before them properly. Reflections on sacred authority. The story of the Persian kings in Egypt raises fundamental questions about power and belief. Can ritual override foreignness? Can sacred kingship be transferred through ceremony alone? What does it mean when the gods of a civilization allow themselves to be served by outsiders? In Egypt, where temples held more power than armies, these were not academic questions. They were the very terms of governance. And perhaps in the end, that's why the idea of divine rulership endured, even as kings, languages, and empires fell away. Final reflection. If the performance of sacred duties is enough to make a man divine, then is kingship merely a costume? Or does divinity emerge in the spaces where duty and belief meet, even for strangers? Story 4. The Crown and the Cross, Constantine's calculated conversion. At the edge of empire. It is the year 312 CE. The Roman Empire is vast but fractured. Decades of civil wars, power struggles, and contested successions have torn it into fragments. Military generals proclaim themselves emperors. Borders shift, allegiances blur, and among the hopeful rulers fighting to unify the realm stands a man named Constantine. His armies are lean, his control tenuous, yet his ambition burns with intensity. Constantine is not just trying to win power, he is trying to define what power will mean in the Roman world to come. He is not a Christian, not yet. The old Roman gods still hold sway in temples and minds. Jupiter, Mars, and Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, are worshipped across provinces. Sacrifices burn in their honor. But something is shifting. Across the empire, a new religious force stirs beneath the surface: Christianity. Once outlawed and persecuted, it has grown in secret, spreading through cities, households, and even the military. It offers salvation, unity, and moral clarity. It also offers something Constantine may need most: divine legitimacy. And on the eve of a decisive battle, Constantine claims he receives a vision. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge. According to the Christian writer Lactantius, the night before the battle, Constantine has a dream. In it, he is instructed to place a strange symbol on the shields of his soldiers, a shape resembling the Greek letters chi, chi, and rho, rho, the first two letters of Christos, or Christ. A different account, by Eusebius, claims Constantine saw a vision in the sky, a cross of light above the sun with the words in this sign, conquer. He awakes and orders his men to mark their armor with the sign. On October 28, 312, Constantine defeats his rival Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge, just outside Rome. Maxentius is thrown into the Tiber. Constantine enters the city as victor. He attributes his success not to Jupiter or Mars, but to the Christian God. But what exactly did Constantine believe? And was his vision a spiritual awakening or a political masterstroke? The politics of conversion. Constantine's conversion is one of the most debated moments in Western history. Was it genuine, opportunistic, a gradual process? The sources, mostly Christian, portray him as a new Constantine, chosen by God to redeem the empire. Yet Constantine was baptized only on his deathbed, nearly 25 years later. In the years following Milvian Bridge, Constantine's approach to religion was measured. He did not outlaw paganism or destroy temples. Instead, he began a slow shift. He issued the Edict of Milan, 313 CE, legalizing Christianity and ending persecution. He gave imperial gifts to Christian churches. He exempted clergy from taxes. He convened councils to settle theological disputes. Importantly, Constantine maintained symbols and practices of Roman authority, sun imagery, imperial titles, and traditional rituals. He did not instantly become a Christian monarch. He became a bridge between the old gods and the new. The new theology of power. What Constantine saw in Christianity was not only salvation, it was a new model of sacred authority. Roman religion had long relied on ritual contracts. The gods granted favor in exchange for offerings, but the Christian God demanded devotion, obedience, and personal belief. In return, he offered eternal legitimacy. This was a powerful idea for an emperor. If Constantine could present himself as God's chosen ruler not just by bloodline, but by divine election, he could unify the empire under a moral and theological framework, not just force. Constantine began to use language once reserved for divine kings in the East. He referred to himself as the 13th apostle. He claimed victories were given by the grace of the one true God. His image appeared on coins alongside Christian symbols, such as the Chi-Rho and the cross. This was not traditional Roman emperorship, it was something new. Building the Christian empire. Constantine did not simply embrace Christianity, he reshaped it. He ordered the construction of great churches. Old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. These were not simple worship spaces. They were imperial monuments, affirming the ruler's connection to sacred geography and eternal truth. He also moved the imperial capital from Rome to Byzantium, later renamed Constantinople. This new city, adorned with Christian churches and imperial grandeur, symbolized a new world order where Christ and Caesar stood side by side. Constantine even minted coins with Sol Invictus on one side and Christian symbols on the other, a bold balancing act between tradition and transformation. A faith without a creed. But Christianity in Constantine's time was not yet unified. It was a patchwork of beliefs, sects, and theological disagreements. One of the most pressing concerns was the nature of Christ himself. Was he divine or created? Equal to God the Father or subordinate? These were not academic debates, they had political consequences. In 325 CE, Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea, inviting bishops from across the empire to resolve the growing Arian controversy. Though he was not a theologian, Constantine presided over the council, funded travel and lodging, and enforced its decrees. The result was the Nicene Creed, a foundational document for Christian orthodoxy. In effect, Constantine had become the arbiter of theology not by force, but by consensus. It was a subtle but seismic shift. The emperor was no longer just a political ruler, but a custodian of divine truth. Unresolved question. Can a single moment, one vision before battle truly transform an empire? Or was Constantine's conversion not a turning point, but a carefully paved road toward sacred power? Constantinople, city of God and emperor. In 330 CE, Constantine inaugurated his new capital, Constantinople, the new Rome. Nestled on the Bosporus Strait, it was a strategic and symbolic choice. Far from the pagan temples of old Rome and closer to the empire's eastern strongholds, Constantinople represented a pivot in time, the turning of the Roman state toward the future and toward God. Constantine did not just build a city, he crafted a vision of sacred monarchy. The imperial palace stood beside churches, senate halls opened to Christian basilicas, and grand processions intertwined military triumph with Christian ritual. Most notably, Constantine placed within the city a column bearing his own statue, dressed as Apollo, with a relic of the true cross or perhaps the nails of Christ's crucifixion buried beneath its base. The message was clear. Constantine was ordained by heaven, standing at the intersection of classical tradition and Christian destiny. The emperor became a type of apostle, ruling not just by lineage, but by divine mandate. Imperial Church and the bishop's throne. While Constantine never claimed to be a priest or bishop, his involvement in the church was deep, strategic, and foundational. He called synods, influenced doctrine, and gave the church its legal infrastructure. Clergy were exempted from certain taxes and civic duties. Bishops gained judicial authority, becoming alternative arbiters of disputes. Churches received imperial patronage, land, and influence. Constantine's model was not one of separation between church and state, but rather a symbiosis. He saw the church as a pillar of imperial unity, and he viewed himself as its divinely appointed protector. The relationship was mutually beneficial. The church gained wealth, legitimacy, and security. Constantine gained moral authority, theological backing, and a religious system capable of supporting the vast machinery of empire. Yet this relationship was not without tension. A church divided. Despite Constantine's desire for unity, the early church was theologically fragmented. Doctrinal controversies flourished. The most explosive was the Arian controversy, sparked by a priest named Arius, who taught that Christ was created, not co-eternal with the Father. This struck at the heart of Christian identity. Was Jesus God, or subordinate to him? Constantine's solution was to convene the First Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. Over 300 bishops gathered, some bearing scars from persecution, to forge a common creed. After days of heated debate, the council affirmed that Christ was begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father. This was the birth of Orthodox Christianity, and Constantine had made it happen. He did not dictate theology, but by bringing bishops together, housing them, and enforcing their conclusions, he positioned the emperor as a mediator between heaven and earth. Yet unity proved elusive. The Arian debate flared again after the council. Constantine himself vacillated, eventually recalling Arian clergy and even baptizing late in life under an Arian bishop. This reveals a contradiction. Constantine's political desire for religious unity was greater than his commitment to any specific theology. The true cross and the Christian empire. One of Constantine's most potent symbolic moves came not from his policies, but from his mother Helena. In the early 320s, Helena, by then a Christian, journeyed to the Holy Land on a pilgrimage. There, she allegedly discovered the true cross, the very instrument of Christ's crucifixion, buried beneath a pagan temple in Jerusalem. Whether literal truth or legend, the discovery became a powerful symbol of Constantine's reign. The cross, once a Roman instrument of execution, was now a source of imperial legitimacy. Helena ordered the construction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, one of the holiest sites in Christendom. Constantine funded its construction, dedicating it not merely as a shrine, but as an architectural claim. The empire now derived its power from Christ's victory over death, not Jupiter's thunderbolts. This was a theological reordering of the world. Rome was no longer at the center of history. Jerusalem was. Paganism, tolerance, and the long goodbye. Despite his support for Christianity, Constantine did not abolish paganism. Temples still operated, sacrifices continued, and pagan festivals remained on the calendar. What he did initiate, however, was a cultural transformation. He stopped state funding for major pagan rites, removed traditional gods from public coins, banned some blood sacrifices in urban centers, redirected state patrona toward Christian institutions. Yet pagan intellectuals, aristocrats, and priests still held influence. Constantine knew the old ways could not be erased overnight. Instead, he allowed Christianity to rise beside the old cults, confident it would outgrow them, and he was right. By the end of the 4th century, under emperors like Theodosius I, paganism would be outlawed. But Constantine never went that far. He practiced religious patronage as political theater, elevating Christianity not by force, but by favor. Death and baptism. Constantine died in 337 CE. Stricken by illness, he delayed baptism until his final days, a not uncommon practice, as some believed baptism washed away all sins and should therefore be reserved for the end. Yet his choice of an Arian bishop, Eusebius of Nicomedia, raised eyebrows. Had Constantine always leaned toward Arian views? Had he simply sought a peaceful death with the least controversy? Or was it, once again, a move to bridge factions within the fractured church? He was buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, surrounded by empty tombs meant for the apostles. His own tomb stood at the center. In death, he took the place of the saints. Unresolved question: can a ruler's faith be measured by doctrine or only by what he builds and preserves? Was Constantine a convert, a patron, or simply a man who saw that the cross could hold an empire together? The saint who was. After Constantine's death in 337 CE, the question of his place in Christian memory began to take shape. He had not died a martyr. He was not a bishop or theologian. He delayed baptism and dabbled in Arianism. Yet his name would eventually be spoken with reverence in sermons, hymns, and iconography. Some called him a second Moses, others a new David. The Eastern Church would later canonize him Saint Constantine, equal to the apostles, the man who gave Christianity not just safety but sovereignty. And yet his sainthood has always felt unusual, not because he was unworthy in the eyes of his era, but because his conversion was never just spiritual. It was political, calculated, strategic. What Constantine offered Christianity was not personal piety but public permanence. He gave the church buildings, laws, and councils. In return, he received immortality in the collective memory. No emperor before him had ruled in the name of Christ. All who came after would be measured by that precedent. The shadow of Constantine. The empire Constantine shaped did not end with him. His sons Constantine II, Constans, and Constantius II divided the empire and struggled with competing loyalties. Some leaned toward Arianism. Others attempted to maintain unity. Christian factions multiplied. Pagan traditions persisted. But Constantine's precedent was unshakable. Imperial authority was now expected to align with sacred authority. Future emperors would arbitrate heresies, fund missionary work, launch holy wars, punish blasphemy, control church appointments. This fusion of throne and altar would define European governance for centuries, culminating in medieval Christendom, papal coronations, and the idea of divine right kingship. In the East, the Byzantine emperors would rule as vicars of Christ on earth. The idea that the ruler was both protector and participant in the life of the church would dominate until the fall of Constantinople in 1453. All of it begins with Constantine. When Rome became Christian. Under Constantine, Christianity did not merely become legal, it became imperial. It was still a minority faith, but it now had resources, protection, and most importantly, identity tied to power. Christian leaders began to think not just as persecuted outsiders, but as shepherds of a state religion. Bishops became judges, advisors, and landowners. Theological debates took on the weight of civil law. Orthodoxy became a political category. Constantine didn't force the church to change, but by drawing it into the machinery of empire, he altered its relationship to the world. The blood of martyrs had watered the early church. Now it stood in marble halls, clad in purple, holding scrolls instead of swords. It had traded the catacombs for basilicas. The cost of power was subtle but immense. A legacy in stone and creed. Visit any ancient church in Rome, Constantinople, or Jerusalem, and you will find Constantine's shadow. His name is etched into the foundations of St. Peter. His patronage built the Holy Sepulchre, the Lateran Palace, and the Church of the Apostles. His symbol, the Chi-Rho, endures in Christian iconography. His council at Nicaea gave birth to the Nicene Creed, still recited by millions. Constantine may not have crafted the theology himself, but he set the stage, giving bishops space to argue, forcing them to reconcile, and making their conclusions binding. In so doing, He moved the divine into the imperial, and the imperial into the divine. The hidden cost of sacred rule. But Constantine's legacy was not without consequence. By binding religion to the state, he created a model that made heresy a political crime, dissent a threat to unity, and spiritual authority a function of political will. The centuries to follow would see Christian emperors exiling bishops, theologians using imperial courts to silence rivals, wars waged over definitions of the Trinity, churches split along doctrinal and imperial lines. In trying to unite the empire through faith, Constantine had hardened belief into bureaucracy. The church gained protection but lost some of its radical edge. It no longer needed to hide, but now it had to conform. Constantine in our time. Today, Constantine's name evokes mixed feelings. To some, he is the great patron of Christianity, the man who lifted the faith from persecution to power. To others, he is the beginning of compromise, the emperor who turned a movement of the poor and persecuted into an arm of the state. And perhaps both views are true. What is certain is that Constantine understood something few rulers ever grasped so clearly, that the rituals of power and the structures of belief could reinforce one another, and if aligned correctly, could transform the world. He did not simply believe, he built. And in that building, he changed the meaning of rulership forever. Final reflection. Was Constantine the first Christian emperor or the last pagan to wear the Christian crown? And in forging the sacred state, did he sanctify power or politicize faith? Story 5, Julian the Apostate, a pagan emperor's last stand. The return of the old gods. It is the year 361 CE, nearly half a century after Constantine's death. The Roman Empire is officially Christian. Bishops debate doctrine in palaces. Churches rise where temples once stood. The memory of the old gods lingers, but their rituals are fading into dust. Then something unexpected happens. A young man named Julian becomes emperor. Not just any man, Julian the philosopher, as he is known to his friends. Julian the Apostate, as history will remember him. In a world now bending toward the cross, Julian seeks to revive the pantheon of old. Zeus, Apollo, Artemis, Dionysus, the gods of Homer and Plato, the gods of Rome's ancestral heart. He will not persecute Christians. He will not outlaw churches, but he will attempt something far more radical. To restore paganism not as superstition, but as a philosophical, ethical, and spiritual system. To bring back the old gods not by force, but by reason. Julian's youth in the shadows. Julian was born in 331 or 332 CE, a nephew of Constantine. After the emperor's death, the imperial family descended into bloodshed. Julian's father and other relatives were murdered in a dynastic purge, leaving Julian orphaned and exiled to remote estates. There he was raised not in courtly splendor, but in books and solitude. He studied Greek philosophy, rhetoric, poetry, and eventually, Neoplatonism, a spiritual school of thought that taught that all reality emanated from a single, ineffable source. To Julian, the gods were not literal beings in the sky, they were emanations of divine order, reflections of a higher truth. His interest in the old religion was not nostalgic, it was intellectual. By the time he entered public life, Julian had privately rejected Christianity. He saw it as dogmatic, humorless, and hostile to classical wisdom. But he kept his beliefs hidden until power gave him the freedom to act. Rise to power. In 355 CE, Julian was appointed Caesar, a junior emperor, by his cousin, Constantius II, a staunch Christian ruler. He was sent to Gaul, modern France, to defend the empire's western provinces from barbarian incursions. Surprisingly, Julian proved to be a gifted general. He won a series of military victories, secured the Rhine frontier, and won the loyalty of his troops. In 360, when tensions with Constantius escalated, Julian's soldiers proclaimed him Augustus' equal in rank to the emperor. Before a civil war could erupt, Constantius died of illness. Julian became sole emperor, and with that, the old Julian re-emerged not the military leader, but the philosopher-priest. He would rule not just with armies, but with ideas. The pagan revival begins. Julian entered Constantinople in 361 and publicly declared his return to the ancient gods. He performed animal sacrifices, reinstated public pagan rituals, and visited the temples Constantine had abandoned. Yet this was not a mere revival of tradition. Julian envisioned a new paganism organized, ethical, and intellectually rigorous. He sought to model it on the Christian Church's strengths: a hierarchy of priests with moral authority, charity and philanthropy organized through temples, instruction in doctrine using Platonic philosophy. He even wrote texts mocking Christianity's internal divisions, calling it a religion of irrational conflict. Julian was not anti-spiritual. He was anti-Christian in the sense that he believed it had corrupted the Roman soul. To replace it, he turned to theurgy rituals meant to unite the soul with the divine. These practices, drawn from Neoplatonist philosophers like Iamblichus, were a blend of mysticism, prayer, and ancient rites. Julian believed that through such practices, the emperor could be a true mediator between heaven and earth, a sacred monarch in the mold of Plato's philosopher king. The religious edicts. Julian did not outlaw Christianity, but he reversed its privileges. He banned Christians from teaching classical literature, arguing they should not use Homer and Plato if they rejected the gods of those works. Restored temple lands and funding. Reopened pagan shrines across the empire. Appointed high priests to oversee regional religious revival. He also wrote against the Galileans, a treatise critiquing Christian scripture and theology. Though the work survives only in fragments, it reveals a sharp, educated mind, one that questioned the logic and consistency of the new faith. Yet Julian's tone was often sarcastic and elitist. He ridiculed Christian practices and scoffed at martyr stories. While he claimed to offer tolerance, his rhetoric sometimes stirred resentment and fear among Christian communities. His reign, though brief, created a deep cultural rift. A brief reign, a lasting question. Julian ruled for just 20 months as sole emperor. During this time, he attempted to transform the empire's religious identity not by erasing Christianity, but by offering an alternative rooted in antiquity, philosophy, and ritual beauty. But would it last? As Julian prepared for a campaign against the Sassanid Persians in 363 CE, he left behind an empire in spiritual tension. Temples reopened, sacrifices resumed, but the population remained mixed. Many in the East remained loyal to Christian bishops. In the West, the clergy held powerful sway. Julian's pagan revival was bold, but perhaps always out of step with history's direction. Then, on a dusty battlefield in Mesopotamia, Julian was struck by a spear, a wound that would prove fatal. Unresolved question: was Julian trying to save a dying tradition, or revive a world that never truly existed? Can ideas rooted in the past survive if they resist the spirit of their age? The March East. In the spring of 363 CE, Julian set out from Antioch with a massive army. His aim: to launch a bold campaign into the heart of the Persian Empire. The Roman East had long been vulnerable to Sassanid pressure, and Julian sought not just to defend Rome's borders, but to deliver a decisive blow to its rival. It would be his first and only major campaign as emperor. But Julian's war was more than military. It was metaphysical. He saw himself as a sacred leader, chosen by the gods to restore the cosmic order that Christianity had disrupted. He carried out rituals, offered sacrifices before the march, and invoked Helios, the sun god and universal logos in Neoplatonic belief, as his divine patron. Where earlier emperors sought battlefield victory for glory or security, Julian framed his expedition as a spiritual conquest, a chance to demonstrate that the gods still bless those who worship them. The Sacred Army. Julian was not only the general, he was also high priest of his campaign. Each morning, he awoke early to perform sacrifices and consult omens. He insisted that soldiers and officers participate in daily rituals. He even penned letters criticizing lax religious observance among his commanders. His tent functioned as a portable temple, where Neoplatonist philosophers and priests debated metaphysics by torchlight. Julian believed that virtue, discipline, and divine favor were the true components of victory, not just troop numbers or tactics. And for a time, his confidence seemed warranted. The Roman army marched deep into Mesopotamia, winning several early skirmishes. Persian forces withdrew, allowing Julian to advance near Ctesiphon, the Persian capital. But then the campaign faltered. The strategy unravels. Julian had expected a decisive engagement, perhaps a swift strike on Ctesiphon to force a treaty. But the Persians refused a pitched battle. Instead, they retreated into the interior, scorching earth and cutting Julian's supply lines. Meanwhile, the summer heat bore down, food became scarce, morale frayed, and worse, Julian had burned his fleet, expecting to forage in the field or seize Persian stores. With no decisive victory and no secure supply, Julian turned north to retreat, harassed at every step by Persian cavalry. Then, on June 26, 363, near Samarra, a skirmish broke out during a Persian ambush. Julian, known for fighting alongside his troops without armor, was struck in the abdomen by a spear possibly thrown by an enemy, or, as some later Christian writers hinted, by one of his own disaffected soldiers. He died the next day. He was barely 32 years old. The emperor's final words. Accounts of Julian's death vary. Some claim he cried out, "Thou hast conquered, O Galilean," referring to Christ. Others suggest he died in silence or muttering philosophical reflections. The phrase became famous in Christian literature, symbolizing the ultimate failure of Julian's pagan ambitions, but there is no reliable contemporary record of the quote. Most likely, it was a literary invention, crafted by later writers to give his death theological resonance. What we do know is this: Julian died believing he had served the gods faithfully. His writings reveal a man who saw his reign not as a mere return to the past, but as a rebirth of sacred harmony, order through piety, reason through ritual. But the old gods did not save him, nor did his soldiers rally to their temples after his death. Aftermath: a swift reversal. Julian's successor, Jovian, was elected by the army in the days following his death. A Christian officer with no taste for sacred philosophy, Jovian immediately reversed Julian's reforms. Pagan temple subsidies were cut. Christian bishops were reinstated. The church regained its privileges. Julian's writings were suppressed or ridiculed. Within weeks, the pagan revival was effectively dismantled. And though a few temples would remain open, and a few philosophers would keep the old traditions alive, no Roman emperor would ever again publicly reject Christianity. The world Julian tried to restore was already gone. Julian's writings, an intellectual legacy. While his political efforts failed, Julian left behind a remarkable body of writings. Against the Galileans, only fragments survive. Letters to friends, philosophers, and officials. Hymn to King Helios, a blend of theology, Neoplatonism, and imperial ideology. Caesars, a satirical dialogue mocking past emperors and Christian figures. In these texts, Julian appears not as a fanatic, but as a man shaped by longing for a world where wisdom and worship were one, where truth came through reasoned devotion rather than revelation. His critiques of Christianity were sharp but not cruel. He saw its rise as a break from ancient harmony, a rejection of the cosmos, beauty, and mystery. And yet, he never quite grasped why Christianity endured. He mistook its lack of philosophy for weakness, its simplicity for ignorance. But Christianity had something paganism did not: a cohesive narrative of salvation, a promise that suffering had meaning, and a structure that could bind communities across class, race, and geography. Julian offered beautiful rituals. Christianity offered hope. Unresolved question: was Julian's failure inevitable, or did he simply arrive a century too late? Could any ruler have restored belief by philosophy alone, when the people had already embraced a new story of grace and resurrection? Julian's paganism after Julian. Julian died in 363 CE. With him, so too died the last serious effort to restore the old gods to political dominance. His vision, a sacred, philosophical pagan state with temples functioning like churches, priests educated like bishops, and rituals imbued with Platonic metaphysics, dissolved almost overnight. In the years that followed, his reforms were not only reversed, they were erased. Pagan rites were increasingly suppressed, temples defunded, and Christianity established itself more firmly within the imperial machinery. Even sympathetic pagans found themselves choosing between tradition and survival. The priesthoods Julian had revived fell quiet again. The Neoplatonist philosophers who had advised him returned to marginal corners of intellectual life. The bright vision of a new old religion faded beneath the steady march of Christian orthodoxy. Memory as martyrdom. Ironically, Julian became something of a martyr not for the Christian church, but for a dying worldview. Pagan philosophers in later centuries remembered him as the last light of a noble tradition. Even Christian historians, despite calling him the apostate, often admired his intellect, restraint, and charisma. He was not a tyrant. He did not burn churches or execute bishops. His failure came not from cruelty, but from idealism. He believed that eloquence, ritual beauty, and spiritual hierarchy could win hearts in a world that had already changed. And while Christianity would continue to evolve, splitting into sects, enduring schisms, and debating doctrine, it would never again be seriously challenged by the cults of Olympus or the rituals of Delphi. Julian had tried to save a tradition that had long since become nostalgic rather than vital. The philosopher's legacy. In his writings, Julian left us not just arguments against Christianity, but a rare glimpse into the mind of an emperor who read philosophy before battle. He was a ruler who sincerely believed that truth could be pursued through reason, beauty, and reverence for the natural order of the cosmos. In works like Hymn to the Mother of the Gods and Hymn to King Helios, Julian expresses a longing for a sacred, harmonized universe, where every soul is a spark from a divine flame and every ritual a way to return home. His political failure does not erase the philosophical integrity of his beliefs, nor does it diminish his courage in pursuing a path most considered already lost. In fact, it may be this very futility that gives his story its power. A mirror for modern times. Julian's story raises uncomfortable questions that still resonate today. What does it mean to revive a tradition in a world that has moved on? Can a faith survive without adaptation, or does survival itself require compromise? Is sincerity enough to change history, or is history always moving in one direction? Julian offered an alternative vision of empire rooted not in revelation, but in reflection, not in doctrine, but in philosophical reverence for the divine. That vision failed, but the questions it asked remain. The irony of the apostate. Julian sought to reclaim Rome's soul, yet became a symbol for everything Rome had already become. He rejected the Christian God, but his efforts to centralize and reform paganism mirrored Christian structures. He tried to replace the church with temples, bishops with high priests, doctrine with metaphysics. In trying to defeat Christianity, he had unwittingly adopted its form. And in doing so, he revealed the truth. Christianity had already won, not just politically, but imaginatively. It offered people not only order and tradition, but hope, intimacy with the divine, and a story that gave meaning to suffering. Julian's gods were majestic and aloof. Christ, by contrast, had bled, died, and risen for everyone. The choice had already been made. Julian's final resting place. Where exactly Julian was buried is still debated. Some say his body was returned to Tarsus in Cilicia, modern-day Turkey. Others claim he was buried near the battlefield in Mesopotamia. No grand mausoleum was erected. No temples enshrined his memory. But his name lived on in whispers among philosophers, in marginalia on manuscripts, and in the imaginations of those who wondered if the old world could have been saved. Final reflection. Was Julian the last pagan emperor, or the first to understand that even empires must answer to faith? And if the gods of old could not save him, did they ever truly rule, or were they, too, just passing shadows in the long twilight of belief? Story 6, Holy Theft, the strange journey of St. Mark's bones. The bones beneath the basilica. If you stand in the heart of Venice today, beneath the golden mosaics of St. Mark's Basilica, amid the scent of salt and seagulls drifting in from the Adriatic, you are standing atop a crime scene. Not one marked by blood or violence, but by something just as bold, sacred theft. Beneath the domes and Byzantine grandeur of this church lie the purported bones of St. Mark the evangelist, apostle, gospel writer, martyr. But he was not born in Venice. He never walked its streets. He was not martyred there, and certainly not buried there. St. Mark's body was stolen from its original resting place in Alexandria, Egypt, by Venetian merchants in the year 828 CE, hidden beneath pork to evade Muslim inspection, smuggled across the Mediterranean, and enshrined as the spiritual heart of a rising city-state. It is one of the strangest, most politically charged acts of religious devotion in medieval history. But how did Mark, a man of the East, become the patron saint of Venice? Saint Mark, apostle and martyr. Saint Mark, according to Christian tradition, was a companion of Peter and Paul, and the author of the earliest gospel. He is believed to have founded the church in Alexandria, one of the 5 great patriarchates of the early Christian world. By the 4th century, Mark was honored as the city's first bishop and its founding martyr. The faithful believed he had been dragged through the streets by pagans and buried near the harbor. His relics, his bones, were kept in a shrine at the Church of St. Mark in Alexandria, watched over by Coptic clergy and revered by local Christians. But relics in the medieval world were more than holy remains. They were symbols of legitimacy, power, and divine favor. To possess the body of a saint was to claim their protection and their spiritual capital. As Christian Europe grew increasingly obsessed with relics, and as Islamic rule tightened across the eastern Mediterranean, Western rulers began to eye the East not just for trade, but for saints. Venice's rise and religious hunger. In the 9th century, Venice was still emerging, part marshland, part mercantile port, caught between the influence of Byzantium and the ambitions of the Franks. It had no ancient roots like Rome, no apostolic see like Constantinople, no grand cathedral to boast of. Its spiritual patron at the time was Saint Theodore, a lesser-known soldier martyr of the East, respectable but not inspiring. To compete with rival cities Genoa, Ravenna, Amalfi, Venice needed something greater, a gospel author, an evangelist, a relic to rival them all. Enter the bones of St. Mark. 2 Venetian merchants, Buono de Malamocco and Rustico de Torcello, were dispatched to Alexandria under the pretense of trade. But their mission was clear: bring back the saint. And so, in the year 828, under cloak of secrecy and sacrilege, they acted. The Great Theft. According to the Venetian chronicle, known as the Translatio Sancti Marsi, the merchants bribed local Christian clergy who feared Muslim desecration of the relics and believed the bones would be safer in Christian lands. With the help of these monks, the merchants exhumed the saints' remains, wrapped them in linen, and placed them in a basket covered with pork and cabbage leaves, a deliberate and clever ruse, since Muslim customs prohibited the handling or inspection of swine. The basket was loaded onto a ship, and the merchants set sail from Alexandria toward Venice. The journey was not without incident. Storms nearly capsized the ship, and later retellings claim that Mark himself appeared in a vision to calm the waves. Whether true or not, such tales helped cloak the act of theft in divine approval. By the time the relics reached Venice, they were not contraband, they were miraculous cargo. Arrival and adoration. The bones arrived in Venice in 828, and the city erupted in celebration. The Doge at the time, Giustiniano Participazio, ordered a chapel to be built near the palace to house the relics. This would become the seed of St. Mark's Basilica, a church not born from martyrdom, but from merchant ingenuity and state ambition. Almost immediately, Mark's symbol, the winged lion, began to appear on banners, coins, and buildings. He was declared Venice's patron saint, replacing Theodore entirely. This was not just a religious shift, it was a rebranding. By adopting an apostle, Venice claimed a direct link to the gospel. No longer merely a commercial hub, it became a spiritual capital, with Mark's relics providing both divine legitimacy and political distinction. The theft became official myth, retold in mosaics and murals etched into the city's self-image. The merchants were not grave robbers, they were agents of providence. A saint in the marketplace. What makes this story unique is not just the theft, but the explicitly mercantile nature of the act. Saints' relics were often moved for protection, veneration, or pilgrimage. But in Venice, Mark's body became a kind of spiritual commodity, wrapped in the logic of commerce. His relics were smuggled like contraband, housed in a city governed by merchants, and used to elevate a trading republic into a sacred polity. Mark the Evangelist had become a Venetian brand. The winged lion flew over fleets of merchant ships. His name was invoked in treaties and battles. He was the silent anchor of the Venetian state, the apostle who legitimized empire. Yet under the grandeur lay a simple truth. Venice had built its spiritual foundation not on revelation or martyrdom, but on a body taken in secret, wrapped in pork. Unresolved question: can the sacred be stolen? Or does belief in the power that flows from it justify even the most unholy origins? From chapel to cathedral. After St. Mark's bones arrived in Venice in 828 CE, they were initially housed in a modest chapel near the Doge's palace. This temporary structure, while sufficient to honor the relic, lacked the grandeur appropriate for an evangelist's final resting place. Over the next centuries, St. Mark's Basilica would grow from a simple shrine into one of the most magnificent churches in Christendom, a glowing jewel of marble, gold, and mosaics, reflecting the ambitions of a rising maritime republic. But the basilica was never just a religious site. It was a civic cathedral, owned not by the church but by the Doge and the Venetian state itself. The Patriarch of Venice, the city's highest cleric, had no jurisdiction over it. This was a theological and political statement. St. Mark belonged to Venice, and through him, the city claimed divine right to govern its people and project its power abroad. A saint's home rebuilt and lost again. In 976 CE, the original basilica burned during a popular revolt. St. Mark's relics were believed lost, possibly destroyed in the flames. Panic followed. Had the city's divine protector perished? Construction of a new basilica began almost immediately, blending Western Romanesque architecture with Byzantine forms, reflecting Venice's unique cultural position between East and West. Mosaics covered nearly every surface, narrating biblical stories, Venetian triumphs, and most importantly, the tale of St. Mark's arrival. In 1063, nearly a century after the fire, legend claimed that the saint's remains were miraculously rediscovered, hidden inside a pillar revealed, of course, through divine guidance. This rediscovery legitimized the newer, grander church as Mark's true sanctuary. Whether the bones found were authentic, or even the same ones brought from Alexandria, is beside the point. What mattered was that the myth was preserved, the relic recovered, and Venice's claim reaffirmed. The Lion of Venice. Over time, St. Mark's symbol, the winged lion, became not only an icon of faith, but a political emblem. Venetian ships carried it on their sails. Government documents bore its image. Foreign embassies recognized it as the seal of the Republic. It appeared in stone reliefs across the eastern Mediterranean on fortresses, ports, and grain warehouses. The lion was both sacred and secular, roaring over trade deals, treaties, and wars. To fly the lion's banner was to act under the apostles' authority, and authority Venice had, quite literally, stolen and sanctified. This fusion of saintly symbol and state sovereignty created a theocratic republic, in which the Doge governed not as a king, but as the guardian of Mark's legacy. Venice didn't just believe it was blessed, it believed it was chosen. Saint's strategic assets. Venice's appropriation of St. Mark wasn't unique. Throughout medieval Europe, relics were powerful tools of political and spiritual leverage. In Cologne, the alleged remains of the three magi became a draw for pilgrims and revenue. In Santiago de Compostela, relics of St. James elevated a minor Galician town into one of Christianity's most important pilgrimage sites. In Canterbury, the shrine of Thomas Becket drew both pious worshippers and royal ire. But Venice was exceptional in its intentional state-sponsored sanctity. The city didn't simply inherit relics. It chose one, stole it, and built its identity around it. This wasn't piety in the traditional sense. It was sacral engineering faith shaped to fit the ambitions of empire. St. Mark's remains served the same function as naval fleets, merchant colonies, and diplomatic alliances. He was a pillar of soft power, making Venice spiritually exceptional, politically sovereign, and economically magnetic. Pilgrimage and pageantry. With St. Mark now enshrined, Venice became a destination. Pilgrims traveled not only to Rome or Jerusalem, but to the lagoon city, drawn by the magnificence of the basilica and the promise of proximity to an evangelist. Venetian festivals were lavish affairs. The Feast of St. Mark on April 25th was marked by processions, relic exhibitions, and political ceremonies. The Doge himself would participate, often walking barefoot in ritual humility, before ascending to his throne beneath the basilica's domes. These spectacles were not mere pageantry. They were ritual affirmations of Venice's myth, a republic founded on commerce, governed by law, but protected by a saint who had chosen it despite never having set foot there. Spiritual contradictions. Yet beneath the gold mosaics and solemn liturgies was a contradiction that even medieval observers noticed. Venice, a city of trade and finance, had built its sacred heart through deception and theft. It honored a saint whose message emphasized humility, sacrifice, and service. It wielded his name in diplomacy and conquest. And it claimed moral authority in the Mediterranean while running a vast economic empire. Was this piety or performance? Did the miracle of St. Mark's arrival truly justify the means? Unresolved question. When faith is intertwined with power, can it remain pure? Or do relics, once politicized, become tools not of God, but of states seeking divine endorsement? Venice expands under the banner of the evangelist. By the 12th century, Venice had risen from humble lagoon settlements into a sprawling maritime power and empire without land, built on ships, contracts, and symbolic authority. And at the heart of it all was St. Mark. The city's control over trade routes, ports, and colonial holdings across the eastern Mediterranean was always accompanied by the image of the winged lion, emblazoned on fortress gates and carved into city walls. When Venetian fleets sailed to Crete, Cyprus, or Dalmatia, they brought not just goods but a sacred presence, the unspoken understanding that these territories were under the protection of an apostle. In this way, St. Mark's relics didn't just stay in Venice. His image, myth, and authority were exported, serving as the spiritual justification for Venice's imperial ambitions. The Fourth Crusade, Saints and Spoils. Nowhere was Venice's spiritual political fusion more evident than during the Fourth Crusade, 1202–1204, a campaign that began with the aim of reclaiming Jerusalem, but instead ended with the sack of Constantinople, Christianity's second most sacred city. Venice played a pivotal role in redirecting the crusade. The Doge at the time, Enrico Dandolo, negotiated with the Crusaders to repay their debts by attacking Venice's enemies, culminating in the devastating plunder of Constantinople in 1204. In the aftermath, relics, icons, and treasures were shipped back to Venice. Mosaics, marble columns, and gilded panels were stripped from Byzantine churches and incorporated into St. Mark's Basilica, turning it into a reliquary of conquest. Among the loot were relics of lesser saints, pieces of the true cross, fragments of saints, skulls, sacred vestments, all deposited near or around Mark's remains, reinforcing Venice's claim to a sacred legacy. Thus, the basilica became a palimpsest of pillaged piety, where spiritual heritage was inseparable from imperial victory. St. Mark as imperial instrument. As Venice expanded its reach into the Aegean Sea, the Levant, and parts of northern Italy, St. Mark remained the unchallenged symbol of its legitimacy. Venetian administrators governed as stewards of the Republic and, by extension, of St. Mark's will. Oaths of office and legal charters invoked his name. His relics were processed through the city in times of crisis, plague, famine, war. To rebel against the Doge was, in a sense, to rebel against St. Mark himself. Yet beneath this devotion, questions lingered. Did the city truly venerate the apostle or merely use his name to sanctify state power? Had Venice become a new kind of temple, one where commerce was worship and saints were state property? The fall of the Republic and the fate of the relics. In 1797, after more than a millennium of independence, Napoleon Bonaparte conquered Venice. The Republic fell, the Doge abdicated, the lion banners were torn down. For the first time since 828, St. Mark's city was no longer sovereign. Napoleon's forces looted the basilica, taking some of its treasures, though the saints' bones, miraculously, were left untouched. They remained in their crypt beneath the high altar. Venice would pass into Austrian control, then become part of a unified Italy. Its power was gone, but its myth endured. The lion still flew on city emblems. The mosaics still gleamed in candlelight. And every year, Venetians still celebrated the Feast of St. Mark, honoring a man who had never set foot in the city but whose body and story had built its empire. A saint's legacy in modern memory. Today, few visitors to St. Mark's Basilica know the full story. They see the glittering domes, the Byzantine spolia, the murals of triumph, and perhaps glimpse the reliquary behind the altar. But the tale of holy theft, of poor-craft smuggling and political appropriation, remains tucked beneath centuries of reverence and art. Mark's body still lies in Venice. His presence still permeates its stones, its stories, its festivals. Yet the question of ownership of who truly possesses a saint remains open. Can a city steal sanctity and make it real through ritual, belief, and beauty? Or does the relic remain, at its core, a stranger in a strange land, co-opted into a myth that served earthly powers more than divine will? Final reflection. When cities build their glory on sacred remains, do they elevate the saint or bury him beneath ambition? And if sanctity can be moved, smuggled, and claimed, is it still sacred at all?